honoured to welcome to the Design Notes studio board game designer and head honcho of Fort Circle Games, Kevin Bertram. Kevin, welcome to the Design Notes studio.
It's great to be here.
So my first question, so often in life, we're not given the affordance to blow our own trumpet. So this question will allow you to be as braggadocious as you want. So first question is, when did you know you were good at what you do?
Well, the interesting thing is I'm kind of good at a lot of things, but I'm not great at anything except for one thing I'm great at, and that's breaking things. And that is actually exceptionally valuable for game design, like trying to break the design, try to understand why a system works. It's also pretty good for being a game player because you can kind of get a feel for how the system works and how to exploit it. But as a designer and a publisher, it's super valuable. And so, taking that core strength and then, I'm good at math and I'm a so-so writer and I really like history and I like the research. And so like kind of tying all those things together, it just made sense that, but I like to break things basically.
So we've been in contact sort of on the internet, and when I think of you primarily as a publisher, because we've spoken sort of business wise about sort of Fort Circle, but of course the first game from Fort Circle was one of your designs. The next game you've got kickstarting is one of your designs. What came first, the sort of idea to publish games or the game design?
It definitely was the game design. And I wasn't planning on designing games, but then, I was reading a book about the First Barbary War and I was like, there should be a game on this. And I couldn't find one. And so I was like, well, I like card-driven games, so let me kind of sketch out a game. And it went from there. And I wasn't committed to publishing it myself, but when I started talking to the other war game or historical game publishers, it was clear that they wouldn't have the same love and attention paid to my game that I would pay to my game if I was the publisher. And because I have a business background, it just made sense to publish it myself. And then, I'm good friends with Jason Matthews, who, has a pretty impressive design pedigree. And so like I was talking with him about what it would take to really make a company that I wouldn't say competes with GMT or companies like that, but is doing games in that kind of quality level or trying to even maybe elevate the bar a little bit. So I was a designer first, but I think always in the back of my head, I knew I wanted to probably do the publishing just because I think we're doing some new and interesting things with how we approach historical games. So,
and so what is your history as a gamer? Because Fort Circle deals with what is colloquially known as war games, historical games. And I saw in the background you've got Star Wars Rebellion, which is, a game that maybe war gamers would not be predisposed to play. I mean, what kind of a gamer are you?
I'd say I guess omni-gamer is a term that's overused, but so when I grew up, my dad did not play Candyland with me. We kicked right off with Risk, and actually Feudal was the first game, and then Risk, and then Axis and Allies, and then my dad really didn't like the Avalon Hill games with counters, but I started playing, a little more heavier war games. So I kind of sort of grew out of that wargaming tradition, but my wife, when we were dating, we played a lot of Scrabble together. And so I definitely love Scrabble, although we don't play that nearly as much. And then, my wife will play historical games and she's quite good at them, like 1960, but like Twilight Struggle doesn't appeal to her because it's, it has nuclear war in it. And she's not going to play a game with Hex and Counter. And so I want to kind of meet who I'm playing games with halfway. So, with her, we played a lot of Terraforming Mars. We play a lot of Dune Imperium. We played Targai. We used to play a lot of Scrabble. And whereas if I'm playing, with Jason Matthews, we're going to probably play something a little more historical war game. So I'll play Monopoly if that's what people want to play. I would probably try to guide them in a direction that maybe we'd play something, an economic game that's a little more interesting than that. But, I don't have any super hard preference about what kind of games I'll play. So I'm not really very good at party games. That's probably the one exception. Dixit, I'm like 0-20. I've never won a game of Dixit, and we were playing that for a little while. And like, I think everybody else liked playing it because I'm, usually one of the better gamers and win quite a bit when we play other stuff. And playing Dixit, I was always dead last. So I guess that's my weak spot.
And you've spoken about, being good at business. I mean, what in your previous life before publishing games do you think has contributed to the success that Fort Circle has become today?
Well, I've owned a couple companies. I had a web design business, and then I worked in the technology industry larger. And it's not hard running a business, but like there's just basic things. You do them a couple times, you get it. Like, here's how to keep accounting books. Here's how to set up a limited liability company. Here's like kind of the basic things to do. Here's how you make sure your expenses aren't outrunning your revenues, or making sure your cash flows doesn't get you in this problem. Like, just like things that you just do through experience. I think that sort of that base of experience is really helpful for starting a new venture, and frankly an industry that is sort of hobby-esque and not always super professional.
And part of the reason I think people follow publishers is because one of the great things about having a publisher as an interface between you and the creator is that the publisher is a quality controller. In some ways, they don't sign something that they don't think is going to fit their brand or is going to make them money. But you own your own publisher, and you're also a designer. How do you ensure that Fort Circle doesn't just become a vanity project for publishing your own stuff?
Well, to be honest, I don't have as much time as I'd like to design. So almost by the time of it, I'm going to be spending far more work doing development work, and then all of the other fun parts of publishing, dealing with the manufacturer, marketing, all of that stuff. And I've been really lucky that I've attracted a number of, like, it's a combination of really new, fresh, interesting designs by new designers. And then, we have designs in the works by David Thompson and Jason Matthews and Volko Runke. And so these kind of really established designers like what we're doing and want to be a part of it, not for all of their games, but at least for some of their games. And so and I think that through the conversations, not only with the other designers, but with our fairly extensive group of playtesters, like it's helpful to understand like what people want to play that meets the kind of role that we want to fill, which is sort of undergamed historical topics with a real emphasis on the history, the slew of historical documents that you see in Votes for Women, the historical essay. It's like trying to really meet that sort of educational historical niche that I don't think is being fully filled by any other companies. So so now it sort of has the company has momentum of its own. Like, people are pitching me on games, and I say no to a bunch of them, but I say yes to some of them because I think they fit in that kind of brand that we're trying to establish.
So you spoke earlier about wanting to stand shoulder to shoulder with companies like GMT. But for me, Fort Circle is different in a couple of ways. So firstly, it seems that in terms of graphic design, stylistically, your games sort of veer away from that classic sort of war game look. And also, you manage to bring out games that are accessible in a way that aren't arcane in the way that many war games are. The way that many... I've played the Coin series from GMT that many war gamers would say these are the light end of war games. And that for me is, as a Eurogamer, pretty complex. What was the ethos behind Fort Circle when you first started the company and you looked into developing Shores of Tripoli?
Well, so obviously we have a really high priority on games that are accessible. And when I thought about how to start a company and how to grow, a customer base, obviously GMT is the standard bearer in our industry, and I have nothing but kind words for them. But as you state, like I think of a coin series as kind of medium weight, and some of those games are actually pretty difficult to teach, and especially to someone new. And so I was like, well, how do we kind of reach a wider base of people? And so for every game we publish, the notion is we're appealing to gamers, and then we're appealing to some other constituency who aren't gamers necessarily, but could become gamers or historical gamers. So with the Shores of Tripoli, it appeals to people who either have some affinity for the Navy or the Marine Corps or pirates, and also that they or might just have an interest in that period of action on the high seas in the 19th century, right? So that sort of the idea is that, well, I want a game that can be learned by someone who isn't a gamer per se, but might be interested, right? Game curious, I guess, people who are interested in the history or some other reason. With Votes for Women, my cat is about to enter the screen, so. So with Votes for Women, Tori and I talked about it, and Tori and I had a little bit of, I wouldn't say battles, right? But through a process of refinement of, it has to be interesting and difficult enough for gamers to want to play it and see some value in playing it, but yet not so difficult that someone who, like, say, is a women's studies major who wants to learn more about the history can pick up the game, right? And so there can be a tension. I mean, there's kind of a natural tension of more detail, harder design versus accessibility. And I think the trick is to find a way to make sure that you're still true to the history, exploring the mechanisms in a way that makes sense, but yet in a way that is also pretty easy to grok for someone who just picks up the game. And so I don't remember exactly what the question was, but there, our goal is to try to meet those two somewhere in the middle where we're appealing to both. And now the risk is that the game ends up being too easy for the game players and too hard for the new players. And I don't think that's happened with either of our first two games, but that's a flip side risk that we face.
So can you give us an overview of your publishing process from sort of signing the game through development into crowdfunding, marketing, and all of that sort of stuff?
Sure. So that process has changed over time. So with the Shores of Tripoli, like, I was talking to other publishers, and then I was getting the feeling like, no, I'm going to have to publish this myself. So I went through probably 15 graphic designers because I was really looking for the right look and feel, and that wasted a good bit of money, but in the long run, I think it was the right thing to do. And then I've ended up, I now work with Mark Rodrigue, who is not only an award-winning designer, but is a fantastic graphic designer. He does all of our maps, and he's doing everything for the Halls of Montezuma. And so, you do that process where you have the initial design, you play test the heck out of it with as wide of a group of people as you can. Then you take that feedback in, you make revisions, then you go through another play test to make sure that didn't break anything. And then once you're really satisfied with the game, then you take it to Kickstarter and go through the Kickstarter process, and then you publish the game. And during Kickstarter, like, I've only spent 1 cent on that, but there's obviously a lot that goes into it, right? How do we market during the Kickstarter versus when do you market once it's in hand? Because like trying to reach a general audience about a Kickstarter campaign is I think very difficult. Reaching game audience is much easier, right? They get it, they're familiar with Kickstarter. So like, how do you balance out where you're doing what kind of marketing at one point during the process? Obviously, now that I'm working with exterior designers, this changes some. Tori was, working with Tori. So over 20 years ago, we were college debate partners for a semester. And then she worked for one of my companies in the 2000s. So like, we've worked together, we know how to work together. And so that process just felt really natural because of our history working together. And so I don't know that it was that much different than when I was working with myself, except this time, right, someone else is the designer driving things, but I'm still coordinating the play testing. I'm still, keeping an eye on how do we make sure the solitaire can work. But now as we're, working with Volko Ruhnke or working with Liz Davidson and David Thompson on games that, are probably a little higher profile than where we were initially, that process becomes a little more formalized, making sure, but it's a lot of it is still the same, right? Like, for Hunt for Blackbeard, which is Volko's game, right? Mark Rodriguez, who's doing graphic design for it. We have a Discord and we talk about where we're going with the components. And I feel like that's a pretty long answer that wasn't super helpful, but I, it's just a process. You take one step and then the next step and then the next step. And then finally, you have a game that sits on people's shelves. So.
And so, as we're speaking, there has been, and I'm not going to mention any names here because I'm classy, but there has been something of a scandal blowing up around money changing hands between publishers and content creators. When you're approaching a Kickstarter campaign, how do you handle that? Previews, playthroughs, that sort of stuff. Do you pay for content to be produced, or do you just provide... I mean, you've provided me with free copies of games for reviews, for instance. Do you do that, or do you do both? And are both necessary?
Sure. So, little side note. So my company is one of the two publishers on the Gamma board of directors, and Jason Matthews represents us on the board. And we obviously have a lot of strong feelings about this and want to see the industry move forward in a way that doesn't violate U.S. law, among other things. But I'm comfortable. However, what we've done. So with Scherzer Tripoli, there was no paid content. Once the game came out, I hired someone to do a playthrough video, which I find to be fully acceptable, right? Mm-hmm. Like, we direct people, like, you want to learn how to play the game, here it is. And then we paid for a playthrough on the Dice Tower that was obviously, listed as a playthrough. And then for Votes for When, we did a little bit more. We had both Rodney of Watch It Played and Liz Davidson from Beyond Solitaire do how to play videos. And I went down to the Dice Tower to record a how to play video, but that was really just an excuse for me to go to Miami to go watch a baseball game. And then their studios happened to be down there. But we've never had a preview video for a Kickstarter, which I find to be a really weird thing to do. Like, where we have someone else hype up the crowd about our game. Like, that's not where we want to spend our money. I mean, we spend our money in copy editing, which it seems like very few other historical game publishers spend any time on. We try to put as much money as we can into the quality of the components. And that's sort of like our marketing is people saying it's a good game and that word of mouth, far more than, hiring someone for $1,500 to say that our game is the greatest game since sliced bread, which nobody believes and everyone sort of tunes out. So, but we do, and then let me say, however, we do, like, I flood the zone with review copies because I think that is completely reasonable. I like to think of, like, what does the book industry do? And, the book industry sends a copy of every book to the Washington Post and to New York Times and to other, book reviewing entities. And even if there's a bad review, they keep sending them. And my attitude is, unless I think a reviewer is acting in bad faith or just kind of not interested in the kind of games we publish, but except for that, like, I'll send a review copy to people. And even if they give one game a bad review, I'll send them another one, like, until they sort of say, like, okay, they just hate our games. Then I would probably stop. But and I think that's healthy. And I think more, I think more publishers in the historical game space should be doing that. Certainly, I think that is pretty standard practice in the wider game space.
So when I look at your games, because I think most gamers would think of Full Circle as a war game publisher, however nebulous that term is you might prefer a historical game, but nevertheless. And then, when I think of companies like GMT, and as I say, they have a very particular feel, a very particular style, a very particular graphic design. And Fort Circle games, they have the lovely little bits. I was playing Votes for Women the other day, and the little check marks and the crosses, and they feel more like hobby board games rather than specifically war games. And I think to some degree that's their appeal. Do you think that your sort of maneuvering within that space will change the kind of ethos behind wargame publishing?
I think the market is naturally always evolving. And while I'd like to, I love all the kudos that we get about how great our games look. But if you look at a coin game, for example, they use a lot of wood pieces. They have far too many charts on the map for me. I mean, that's not, I like a cleaner aesthetic. But, in general, right, there's that kind of I think that some games that, we're talking about GMT, that they publish do sort of have that quasi Euro appeal. And I think they're also, they're expanding the kind of games they're publishing. In fact, I'm a little grumpy that some of the games they're publishing, I wish we were publishing, because I think they'd be a better fit for us. But yeah, so yes, I mean, we are definitely trying to make games that look good, but part of that comes from, so I worked in a game store when I was in college, and we sold nice chess sets, and we had a small selection of Avalon Hill. It was in a mall, so it was a more mainstream. And a lot of people just wanted a gift of a game that looks good, that they'll probably play, hopefully play, but also that looks good. And so that was always like I wasn't going to publish an ugly game. Early on in the Shores of Tripoli, people were saying, "Oh, you should use how counters instead of these wood meeples." And I'm like, no, that's not what kind of games we want our games to look like. We want them to look good and inviting and fun to play. So did I dodge your question?
No.
I feel like I
That's
keep
great.
doing that.
And often when people think of war games, historical games, they think of dry games. They think of games that are either for grognards in cellars or games that are didactic, and they prize sort of education over play. Why should we, as gamers, who are playing fantasy games and sci-fi games, why should we go towards historical games?
Well, I'm not sure if the premise is mostly true, but not 100% true. I mean, I think about Civilization, which lots of people played growing up. That it wasn't graphically appealing, but it was certainly I don't think it was. Well, what happened is the war game industry was interesting, and then it became more and more insular, and the games became more and more complex, and then that made it, it was this death spiral that it became less and less and less interesting. I think about when Jason Matthews published and Ananda Gupta designed Twilight Struggle. No one thought it would sell very well, but instead, it sold a couple 100,000 copies, and that's because it was doing something new in an interesting way, kind of broke out. And now I think wargaming is doing that now too, or historical gaming, right? We're looking at topics that aren't just military wars. We're kind of expanding that out. Now, how do we appeal to the fantasy gamer or the sci-fi gamer? I mean, they've got to have an interest in history, right? If you're not interested in history, you're not going to play Votes for Women, most likely, right? Or you might do it as a favor to a friend who really wants, but so there needs to be some level of interest, and we're not going to just if I wanted to make money, I would not be making historical games. I would be making sci-fi games and fantasy games, but that's not where my interest is. And so the notion is there are enough people who are interested in historical games that will try them, but we do want to convert some of those people. And like you said, I have Star Wars Rebellion back there. That's a war game to me. I mean, it's a science fiction game, but it takes a history. I mean, it's a history, a long time ago.
Galaxy far away, but geographically yes. A long way away.
Yes, but it takes this history that we have now, what's canon, and the personalities that were in it and the major events, and it lays them out in a tapestry that you can play the narrative. And of course, you can change it. You can make an alternate history to what the Star Wars history is, but it's a historical war game in that sense. And so, right, if you're fascinated, I loved the series Andor, but Andor was fundamentally about starting a revolution against a overwhelmingly, corrupt empire. And, there's a few of those in real history too that might be interesting to play.
So,
Yeah.
so votes for women. I was speaking to Tori about this, and I sort of posed a similar question. I think votes for women. I think unless you're on the extreme end of some crazy political ideology, the idea of female suffrage is pretty much a battle that's been won at this
You would
point.
think so.
But to what degree, when you're producing a game like Votes for Women, when you're producing an historical game, do you want the ethos, the viewpoint, the political position of the designer to come through the game, or do you want it to be an objective historical document dealing with the sides and trying to put us in a place where, we get into the minds of the people at the time?
Well, I think Votes for Women does both of those things, right? I mean, I think unequivocally Votes for Women says that women's suffrage is a good thing, right? That's not hidden from that at all. And I think that, I think Tori did an amazing job of taking some of the arguments that were used about women's suffrage 100, 150 years ago, and how there's sort of some of those same arguments in slightly different clothing are being made about suffrage or about women's rights or different, kind of political issues of the day. And I think that's really valuable for a person to recognize, history has an effect on today. And sometimes it's not a direct repeat, but there's obviously some, it rhymes. And so I think we can do both of those things, right? And Tori's viewpoint is probably much further to the left than mine, which is probably more centrist. But yet we both can agree on the basics of the history, and we can agree on, we're having a conversation, and that conversation is good for both of us, and it's good for anybody else who is engaging that conversation. But it doesn't change any of the historical facts that, the suffrage movement did some great things. The suffrage movement was filled with racists at the same time. That some of the opposition to suffrage was from a very left perspective, like Emma Goldman, and some of it was from, from capitalist companies that were worried that suffrage would hurt their business. And so, being able to have an honest, straightforward discussion about the history is good, I think. How can that be bad?
So, going on then, what do you have coming out in the future? What can we expect from Fort Circle?
Sure. So, I'm not sure when this will play, but I think that whenever this is live, that our Kickstarter for the Halls of Montezuma will be out. It's a companion game to the Shores of Tripoli. Both come from the Marine Corps hymn, From the Halls of Montezuma to the Shores of Tripoli. And it is a 2-player game, although there's a solitaire mode between the refighting the Mexican-American War. But it uses the same core 27 card system. You have core cards and battle cards and the same things that you saw in the Shores of Tripoli. But we added on a political system. So the American player is fundamentally the Polk administration. You have to have treaties signed in Congress. You have to get funding for your war effort. So you have to manage your arrangement with Congress, which is easier to do the more you're winning on the battlefield. And then you also prosecute the war. The Mexican player is really not just the Mexican army and the Mexican government, but it's also the nascent anti-war movement in the United States. It's the Whig Party. It's Mother Nature. It's indigenous tribes who were primarily the Apaches and the Comanches, who were in the same area where the two armies were fighting. And so everyone who's sort of opposed to the Polk administration, you're trying to stop the Polk administration from fulfilling its goal, which is to, have Texas and California and all be part of the United States, and to, yeah. So I'm really excited about that. And so I have a co-designer for that, my friend Gilberto Lopez. And then we decided it was so interesting in a co-design process, which is the first time I'd done it, that how much, the different perspectives that we would bring. He's Mexican-American, I'm an American. And so how it really made us refine and think about the assumptions that we had in the game. And so we took that so much so that like we have two historical essays in the booklet. One is by Amy Greenberg, who's probably the best known Mexican American scholar in the United States, and then by Coney Marquez, who's a Mexican scholar talking about the war from a very different perspective than we would get from an American. And so we're kind of like trying to approach that war from both sides. And there's not really a good guy in this, right? Like the American government was engaged in, an imperialist land grab. I can't say the Mexican government was particularly great at the time either. So, but through that history, that comes out, and we're really excited about that. Boy, I talked a lot about that game. I should probably tell you about some of the other games we have. We also have a game called First Monday in October. It's designed by Talia Rosen. It's on the history of the Supreme Court, and I'm very excited about. Well, I'm excited about the game in general. One of the things we do is we always have a charitable partner for our games. So we donate $1 from the purchase of any game to a charity. So for both Shows Tripoli and Halls of Montezuma, it's the Toys for Tots Foundation, which is run by the Marine Corps Reserve. For Votes for Women, it was the League of Women Voters. For the game about the Supreme Court, First Monday in October, the Supreme Court Historical Society is our partner, and they have been just super enthusiastic about helping us with documents and like all kinds of little things to really include. And so that's been a great partnership. And that game, like people have been waiting for that game for a while, and it is outstanding. And then after that, later this year, I would expect will kickstart and probably for 2024 delivery, Hunt for Blackbeard, which is by Volker Ruhnke. This was a game that originally was going to be published by GMT, but they wanted a solitaire version. And because it's a deduction game, partially, right, you're hunting, that was really hard to do. And so we all agreed that it would make more sense for us to publish that. And then in the next tranche of games, we have, there's a game I can't mention because I don't have all the signatures on the contract yet, but it won the Consim Jam recently, and the game is on a peace treaty. And I guess that's all I'll say about that. We have David Thompson and Liz Davidson's Night Witches, which I'm super excited about. There's a song by a Swedish hard rock band about the Night Witches, and I reached out to them just like in conversation. It turns out they designed a historical game called A Battle Through History. I'll show it to you, but it's part of the stack I have for here. So I'm very excited about Night Witches and some of the opportunities there. And then after that, my wife has a game on the history of the guano trade, which is more of an economic historical game that I'm very excited about. A little side note, there was the richest Englishman who was not a noble in the late 1800s was this guy, Mr. Gibbs, and he had the monopoly on importing guano. Do you know what guano is, right?
Yeah, bat feces, yeah.
Yeah, well, mostly bird in this case, but yes, both. So he had a monopoly on importing bird poop from Peru which had the best bird poop or best guano to England. And so he became super wealthy. And so school kids would sing a ditty that said, "Mr. Gibbs made his dibs selling the turds of foreign birds." And just like, that's too good of history to like be forgotten. So, and then Jason Matthews has two games. One is on the abdication of King Edward VIII and Wallace Simpson. And then he has a game on the treason trial of Aaron Burr, who killed Hamilton, but that's not what he was on trial for. He was on trial for something else. And then we have some other designs down the road that we'll see. So a lot of stuff. I'm hoping that we can, have 2 more games published this year and probably 4 next year. So that's a pretty aggressive schedule for a company that hasn't published a lot of games. So
you go to a convention and you go out in the evening for a meal, and you come back from the loo and you walk past the table and there's a group of gamers and you hear Fort Circle mentioned. And so you sidle into the corner and you eavesdrop on their conversation. What do you hope they're saying about you?
I hope they're saying, "Boy, we want to buy more of their games." No, I mean, it's mostly the things that I've said here. Like, I want people to appreciate the care that we put into the history of the game, that the mechanics are a good representation of the historical choices that the protagonists had in the game, that that the rule books are clean and clear, and and how to play is very accessible. Like, I mean, those are the the things that we've been talking about, the things that are important. And it's all kind of that what I think the brand of the company should be. And we've only published 2 games, so it's hard to say we have a really loud brand, but we're trying our best to make that brand make sense.
So, final question then: why is gaming good?
Um, I look at it from 2 perspectives. First is kind of an educational perspective, right? People learn in different ways. Some people read, some people listen to a lecture or watch a documentary, and some people learn by doing. And gaming is kind of a subset of learning by doing. And so, I think it's just fascinating to learn through playing games. But on the second sense, it's also kind of fun, and it's a way to spend time with people you like. My wife and I often play Terraforming Mars with another couple. He's a actual rocket scientist from England, so and he'll usually cook, and the 3 of us will chat, and then I'll usually do the rules explaining, and then we'll play. And well, I mean, Terraforming Mars, we all know how to play, but if we're playing something new, and it's just a great way to spend an afternoon with friends. Could we do that without the game? Certainly. And we go out to dinner, but there's something about having this communal activity together that is really gratifying. So, yeah.
Excellent. So if people want to get hold of Fort Circle and see what they're up to and everything, how would they go about doing that?
So I'm fairly active on Twitter. Fort Circle is my handle, I guess it's called. Our website is fortcircle.com. I also actually write a blog about the publishing industry, sort of, or publishing game in game publishing industry, and that's at ludorum.substack.com. That's free, and I go pretty in depth. Like, I'll share specific sales numbers that I think people who are interested in publishing probably would find interesting. So so you can find me there as well.
Brilliant. Well, Kevin Bertram, thank you very much.
Awesome.